Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so very glad you've joined me this evening, wherever you are in the world. And I just want to thank all my subscribers for their incredible support, because do you know what? You make it all the worthwhile doing this. And I just say that if you are interested in cryptid tales and you love a good story, then this is the channel for you. And I strongly recommend that you subscribe, because we have got some amazing stories lined up that you don't want to miss out on. The story tonight is one of those phenomenal stories. And it's a story where a woman actually believes that the Bigfoot that she sees in the woods is guilty for this woman's murder. But in reality, it is not Bigfoot who is the guilty culprit. It is her own husband. So let's get started. I know you're going to love the story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, the story I have to tell you and your listeners is so utterly shocking that it sounds completely implausible and highly improbable. But I assure you it is 100% true. I never imagined that all the murder mystery novels that I had loved reading as a child would actually sprout roots and become a very real reality in my own life. Those dreadful stories you hear about in the news about weirdos that perpetrate the most horrifying, heinous murders is not something you expect to arrive at your own front doorstep one day. After all, is it not the case that those sort of things always happen to somebody else and never to you? My story begins in the fall of 1987. At that time, I'd been married to my husband for 5 long years and considered myself to be extremely happily married. And I really believed that my husband felt the same. Little did I know about the secret dark world that my husband inhabited inside his own mind, a world so horrifyingly evil, it would tear the fabric of my reality wide apart, like a huge, festering, raw, open wound that would struggle to heal over for many long years. I still remember the day that I married Dan as if it was yesterday. It was pouring with rain outside at our local church, and my glorious white princess-style gown got completely soaked and soiled and covered with all these horrible muddy marks because no one had thought to bring an umbrella. Lightning flashed across the sky, and I heard the loud rumbles of thunder literally shake the ground so violently that even the dark limousine I was sitting in with my father beside me seemed to wobble under its heavy vibration. Maybe it was a menacing omen that was a warning of the unbelievable and unspeakable horrors that would be birthed into my own life sooner than I imagined possible. "That is some storm," said my father, "and on your wedding day of all things. What a dreadful shame, and not good for the photographs either." He looked at me with concerned blue eyes, and then quite suddenly shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I could tell he wanted to say something, but was holding back the words by biting his lips awkwardly. "Out with it, Dad," I urged. "Say it. I'm big and ugly enough to take it. Go on. I want to hear what you have to say." My father took my hand in his and squeezed it reassuringly, and then he looked at me and said, "Big and ugly, you most certainly are not. Why, I have never in my life seen you look more beautiful as you do today." He paused for a moment, and then he said, "You do not have to go through with this wedding. You can change your mind, and no one will think any the less of you." I stared at my father in horror. "You don't like Dan, do you, Dad?" I asked, with a sudden horrified realization, because it had never occurred to me that he felt that way about my fiancé and husband-to-be. My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and I could see it pained him to be talking as frankly and as openly as this. "There is something about him that is very off. Your mother and I have tried our hardest to like him, but we get a very uneasy vibe around him. There is something about him that we just can't warm to." "Dad," I cried, salty tears rolling down my cheeks, "I really, really love him. I can't switch off those feelings, you know." Well then, said my father, tightening his grip on my hand, if you love him, then wild horses cannot stop you from marrying him, least of all me. I just want my little princess to be happy, that's all. After all, that's all that matters. I hugged my father tightly, but his haunting words hung in my mind like an ominous looming dark cloud of uncertainty and a foreshadow of the grim reality that was inevitably to come. I remember meeting Dan's parents for the first time on our wedding day. I really got the strong impression that his father was a very imposing man with a really willful, cantankerous disposition, while his wife, by contrast, was subservient and quiet like a church mouse, and looked at me with wide, brown, frightened eyes. And she never spoke a single word, not even to congratulate me. It was all exceedingly peculiar. Dan and I settled in a delightful, quaint, almost whimsical-looking cabin in the countryside. Our place was very remote, exquisitely surrounded by hazy blue and purple mountainous valleys and dense areas of natural forest, with tall, majestic trees gracing the landscape. There was also a huge silvery pond on the right-hand side of the forest, set against a large mountainous outcrop of rocks. This little pond was a favourite spot for the deer to congregate, and I would spend many days watching them through my binoculars as they drank the full, cool, fresh water. I had always loved watching the deer bobbing and darting around our land, because they seemed so serene and so gentle by nature, and watching them calmed me down in rare moments of tension that I sometimes experienced. My husband had his own outhouse, literally encroaching in the wooded area on our land. It was turned into a workroom for his carpentry practice. He made furniture for a living, and some of his work was utterly phenomenal. He would design the most gorgeous kitchen cabinets for people, and he would transform old pieces of furniture into modern masterpieces. Where we lived was very remote and off the beaten track, which is exactly what my husband wanted. He did not like socializing or mixing with people much, and I just thought it was because he was quiet and reserved as a person. I had no idea how emotionally dysfunctional he actually was. One day, a glitzy pink Jeep drove down our gravel pathway towards the outhouse where my husband worked. Potential clients would always come to see my husband and how he was getting on with their various projects that they had assigned him to do. On this one occasion, a very glamorous, attractive tall woman with shoulder-length hair, who was wearing tight leather pants and a white cotton shirt, got out of her bright pink Jeep. I ran out of the cabin to greet her, something I always did when my husband's clients arrived on our property, just to be courteous and civil, and to help navigate them towards the outhouse that some struggled to find, because it was secretly tucked away on the edge of the woods and was so well camouflaged it was almost impossible to sometimes see. "I'm looking for Dan," she said. "Is he around? He's restoring a beautiful dresser for me, and I just can't wait to see it before he delivers it to me tonight. I can't wait, I'm so excited." "Of course," I said. "Follow me." I smiled at her as I directed her to the outhouse, secretly wondering if this tall, statuesque blonde woman was some kind of a fashion model. She certainly was tall enough, and she definitely fit the criteria, I thought. The following morning, as I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and sifting through the newspaper, my attention was drawn to a picture of a blonde woman on the cover. I was almost certain I recognized the picture. Had I not seen that face before? It did look distinctly familiar. Of course, it was the woman I saw yesterday on our land, the one who was having her dresser restored by my husband. I proceeded to read the article, and it read, "Beautiful blonde model vanishes from her home mysteriously last night." I could hardly believe what I was reading, and I rushed to Dan's outhouse to show him the article. "She was here yesterday," I said, "and now she's gone missing. Did you not deliver her dresser to her last night? That's about the time she must have vanished. Maybe you saw something. You know, you should call the police. You might have been the last person to see her before she actually went missing." My husband's response was both curt and cold. "Are you smoking something, babe?" he joked. "There was no such woman on our property yesterday. You must be imagining things. I never restored a dresser for such a woman, nor did I deliver anything like that. You are clearly confused and mistaken for some reason." "But," I insisted, "you restored her dresser. Don't you remember yesterday? I even saw you packing it up last night in the back of your van and driving off to her place for the delivery." My husband barked at me in a tone that I shall never forget, and I have never heard him use such an angry tone before in my life. "I've never seen the woman before. Now leave me alone. I have work to do." I scurried away like a frightened rabbit because I'd never seen my husband react to me this aggressively before. But I dismissed it all, telling myself that my husband was having a bad day and was just a little grumpy. He must have forgotten about the lady and the delivery. Maybe one of his clients was piling on pressure for him to get a job done. Who knows? I knew that Dan was never reacting well to stressful situations or to overly demanding clients. But one thing I did know was the girl in the paper had been on our property yesterday, and clearly my husband had no recollection of her, which was very strange because she was very striking and was a woman you would be unlikely to forget. It was all decidedly odd, but I decided to just let it go. After all, what else could I do? In my gut, I probably knew he was lying to me, but I was not going to believe such a feeling. I just couldn't, not about my own husband. The next day, I ventured into the forest for a walk. In truth, I had not ventured in there many times before, and it was an area my husband did not want me to explore for some reason. He always told me that the woods were full of dangerous predators and that I should never go in there unaccompanied because it was not safe to do so. But I was not convinced that that was the case during the daylight. At night, of course, it was a different matter. On many occasions, I'd heard the calls of coyotes and even mountain lions, and last night I had heard a peculiar noise that I couldn't explain. It was the sound of a woman screaming as if she was being murdered. I had heard that sound on 2 other occasions before, including strange wood knocks and whooping sounds coming from the woods, the origins of which I could not explain and remained a mystery to me. I grabbed my husband's rifle just to be safe and went exploring the woods. What Dan didn't know would not hurt him, and besides, I fancied a little adventure all of my own. As I entered the forest, I noticed that everything seemed unusually quiet. You literally could hear your own breath in front of your face. That is how deadly quiet it was, which was remarkably unsettling. I cannot explain it, but I sensed something was distinctly off, but I couldn't tell what it was. I was just surprised to see that there were no signs of life, like a pretty squirrel darting up a tree, or the gentle face of a deer chewing its cud while staring at me with curious eyes through the pretty green undergrowth. I felt a sense of disappointment because the woods seemed more menacing rather than enchanting, the latter of which I had hoped to experience. However, I was not to be put off, and then suddenly I smelt the most rank smell you could ever imagine. It was like the sweet smell of death and decay, the kind of smell you might expect to encounter if you were to stumble across a rotting corpse. And that smell seemed to merge with yet another smell that was even more mystifying. It smelled sulphurous and sweaty in its undertones, rather like a pair of cheesy trainers. It was all rather bizarre. Suddenly I heard the sound of digging, like someone very hefty and strong was pulling up the earth, and I could hear the crunching sound of heavy feet pressing against leaf litter on the forest floor. I suddenly realized that someone was on our land, and since this was private property, I knew that this individual, whoever he was clearly trespassing. What was he doing, I wondered, digging on our land like this? It was all very strange. It was hardly as if our land was sitting on a gold mine or something. I decided to find out who this intruder was, Maybe I knew him, as I knew many of the locals in our town. And in my heightened curiosity, I tiptoed forward as quietly as I could, hoping not to disturb the crunching leaves under my feet, and I tried to avoid making a loud enough noise to draw any attention to myself. Luckily, the digging sound seemed to mask any sounds that I was actually making. Then I saw him, the dark, shadowy figure of the intruder, and his back was turned away from me. I crept closer to get a better view of him, using my binoculars, and then I focused in on the individual to see if I knew who this mystery man may be. I nearly dropped my binoculars in horror. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. This was no man, but what on earth was it? For a moment I was unable to believe what I was seeing. The creature was covered with hazel brown hair with silvery tips, and his whole body was covered like a bear. What on earth was this thing? Suddenly it turned to the side, and his head looked in my direction when the sound of a shrieking hawk flying overhead grabbed his attention and made him look my way. In that moment, my binoculars focused fully on his face, which was hairless and grey and almost human in appearance, with ape-like influences. The eyes were large and brown and wider set apart than ours, but very deep set. There was also a distinctive brow ridge, a very flat black nose, and thick lips. I noticed that the head was shaped like a bullet, and it literally flowed into the shoulders into a single piece, giving me the impression of little or no neck. The shoulders on this thing were massive, like the shoulders that you would expect to see in Olympic swimmers who do that butterfly stroke, and the upper torso and weighty arms were equally as impressive. The creature was shredded like a prime athlete and was ripped in the torso area, and although it was covered with hair, I knew he had a six-pack. There was no question about that. And he had slender, muscular, very strong legs. If I had seen such a body shape on a man in a supermarket aisle, I would assume he graced the covers of the World's Strongest Men magazine. This creature looked like he could lift a car without even breaking a sweat. That's how enormous he was. I would say he was at least 1,100 pounds and 9 foot tall, and possibly 4.5 feet wide, and that's not exaggerating. In that moment I was more in awe of this apex predator rather than in fear of him, but that was soon to change as I continued to watch this creature with an intriguing fascination, all the while making every effort not to be detected by this thing. What was this creature doing? He had this massive, thin trowel-shaped stone in his hand, and he was using it like a tool to dig up the loose soil. Suddenly I saw this white human leg flop out of the soil, much like a plastic doll, and the creature finally pulled out the long body of a woman that looked like a tiny Barbie doll in his humongous hands. He threw the limp body that was blood-soaked up and down in his hands like a bouncy ball and grunted for a while. He even slapped the cheek several times on the face as if he was trying to wake up the body, and when he got no response from the corpse, he made a few more frustrated grunts, and even used one of his large hairy feet to nudge the body, pushing it back and forwards under the foot several times, as if hoping to get some kind of response from the corpse. He kept doing this and looking at the face, half expecting it to rise up from the dead. He then seemed to lose interest in the dead body, realizing that the life was truly deceased and was incapable of being revived. He grunted sorrowfully a few more times to himself, and then, just like a silverback gorilla, he glided into the woods and was gone from my sight. I realized with utter horror and delayed fear that seemed to rush through my body like a steam train of horror that this horrendous, monstrous creature had killed this woman and buried her and retrieved her from a shallow grave. I was certain at once that this was the missing woman that I had seen yesterday, who had been visiting my husband's outhouse and had been attacked and killed by this deranged, hairy creature. I did not ask myself the obvious questions that I should have. Like, why was my husband the last person to actually see her alive? And did he not deliver her a dresser last night? And why was he clearly so blatantly lying about having seen the woman in the first place? Instead, I allowed my irrational bias to cloud my judgment, and I refused to believe the truth that was clear to be seen. After I was sure that the dangerous predator was not coming back, I boldly ventured towards the body. My worst fears were confirmed. It was indeed the corpse of the poor woman I had seen a couple of days earlier, and her white dress had turned crimson because it was soaked in blood, and the bloody stains coated her white skin in a red-brown mask. I ran out of the forest screaming at the top of my lungs and calling out for my husband, "Dan! Dan! Dan! Dan!" I had forgotten that he was out, delivering a chest of drawers to another customer. I immediately dialed the police with clumsy fingers that felt like sausages, as it was so hard to dial the numbers because I was shaking so much. That's how clumsy I was. Before I knew it, the police were buzzing around our property like a hive of bees. The medical examiner was called, and there was crime scene tape everywhere, and glooming, serious faces on all the police officers. I saw the dead body of the missing woman being placed on a gurney, and then put into the medical examiner's van. Finally, I was taken to the police station myself for an interview, and they ushered me into this gloomy, oppressive little interview room without any windows, and proceeded to ask me hundreds of awkward questions about my husband, whom I began to realize was the prime suspect in this case. I told the police that my husband had absolutely nothing to do with the grisly murder, and that the real perpetrator of this crime was a hairy humanoid ape-like creature that I had seen in the woods, playing with the body and slapping the face with its hands. It was huge, I told them, a really big, massive monster. This ghastly thing has killed this woman and buried her and subsequently retrieved her. I had seen him doing this myself with my own eyes, and he was scarier than a lion and infinitely more treacherous. I could see the police officer rolling his eyes at his friends, as if to say, "We've really got a big nutcase here." The more I went on about the hairy ape-like beasts, the less seriously the policeman took me. I even heard one officer tell another that I was deliberately covering up for my husband with such an elaborate story, and the other one replied that at least I made things more humorous and interesting with my remarkable imagination. I did not hesitate in giving the police permission to search our property without a warrant, because I knew we were innocent and had nothing to hide. Imagine my surprise when the police officer in charge of the investigation dragged a chair towards me, and with a serious look on his face, he put down a bloody knife and a rag on the table in front of me and said, "Recognize this?" I looked up in horror at the officer. "That's my kitchen knife," I said. "It's been missing for a while now." "Do you know where it was found?" asked the police officer. "No," I said. "It was found in your husband's outhouse, under some loose floorboards, with all these little mementos," he said, pulling out a few pieces of jewelry on the table. "These are the trinkets belonging to 3 other missing women, all presumed dead." Suddenly the light went on in my mind, like a lighthouse lighting up the darkness that hid so many treacherous secrets that were now finally exposed in the cold, hard, brutal light of day. I could hear my heart pounding through my chest like a heavy drum. "My husband did this?" I asked, already knowing what the answer was, but I needed to hear it verbally from the officer to really believe this. Could this really be happening to me? It all seemed so surreal. "I'm afraid so. We've been looking for your husband for a very long time." "But," I protested, "are you really sure about this? I mean, could you not be mistaken?" I saw the officer almost look at me with a pitiful expression on his face. "I'm afraid," he said, "the evidence does not lie." It was not long before my husband was arrested and charged with 3 murders, because 2 other bodies were recovered in that forest. The police suspect that he may have been involved with other heinous murders of several other missing women, but my husband was not going to talk and refusing to make any comments. I remember the judge describing my husband as the most calculating, despicable, evil man that she ever had the privilege to sentence, who had a heart that was so cold it would actually melt ice. I was relieved to learn that those horrendous crimes were not sexual in their motivation, although that is not altogether true, because the psychological profiler of my husband described him as a man who had an intense loathing of the female sex. He felt women were grossly inferior to their male counterparts. He had such a hatred for women, especially those who assumed successful roles in society, and it repulsed him so much that to express his rage, he chose to murder those women by stabbing them hundreds of times over, even long after they were dead. I suddenly remembered my husband's mother's behavior at the wedding. I could tell that she was well and truly patronized and belittled by his father, who was possibly a huge bully. I could not help wondering whether in a few years' time I would have ended up being as submissive and as pathetic as her. Somehow I thought it highly likely. I thought back to my wedding day and all the ominous warning signs that were so clear to see. If you were not so blinded by love as I believe I was at the time. There was the soaked-soiled wedding dress, the flashing lightning and the booming thunder, and then the gentle voice of my father telling me that something was really off about my husband. Why had I not listened? What was wrong with me? Why had I not seen all the telltale universal signs telling me not to marry this horrendous man? Then there was that curious, strange creature in the woods, the likes of such I have never seen in my life. The police had laughed at my story, thinking I had made it all up, because such a creature did not exist. Yet I knew what I had seen, and that thing was very real. I did, however, falsely accuse it of murdering the woman, but you've got to admit it. If you saw a Goliath hairy monster bouncing a dead woman in his hands like I did, is it not going to make you conclude that he had something to do with her death? Even a rocket scientist would assume that. The more I think of it now, the more I realize that the creature was trying to rescue the poor dead woman. He pulled her out of the ground. He must have smelt her body. He slapped her face and tried to revive her. But when he realized she was dead, he knew there was nothing he could do about it, and he wandered away. I truly think he was sad that he couldn't get her to be revived. He must have detected the shallow grave where my husband buried the woman. And possibly, I think, he did try to revive her. In a strange, twisted way, I am grateful to that creature, because if he had not dug up the dead body of that woman, I might still be married to that monstrously evil man today. And who knows, there may be more dead corpses under the forest floor, and more women who lost their lives to my monstrous husband. My husband was given the death sentence, but he hung himself in a prison cell with a sheet after he was sentenced. And I have to say to you, I did not shed a tear for him. The only tears I've ever shed are the tears of remorse for all those lost lives that were brutally lost at the hands of my monstrous husband. For a long time, I felt very ashamed of not seeing through my husband, and it really upset me. There were so many if-onlys in my life. If only I had seen this. If only I had done that. And then one day I decided that I was punishing myself way too hard. It was then that I chose to let it all go and start again. And now I'm happily remarried to the kindest person you could hope to meet, with 2 wonderful girls, and better still, my father and mother approve of my marital choice, which means the world to me. It was only 12 years ago when I realized that the creature that I had seen that day in the woods, unearthing the dead corpse of the woman, was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch. And in a way, I'm thankful for what he did, because ultimately he showed me the monster I was married to, and help me close that door on that chapter of my life that I would so much rather not remember. Well, do you know what? I think it's incredible that the Bigfoot smelt the dead body. He sensed that there was something recently buried there because it had been buried the night before. Who knows, maybe even the Bigfoot saw it. And he tried to save the dead lady, but it was just too late. I think everybody is going to love that story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.